So Dr. Sarah Lombard is currently an assistant professor in igneous processes at the University of Utah, but she's had positions, she has her both bachelor's, master's, and PhD in earth sciences from Blaise Pascal University in France. She has held positions as a postdoc at Caltech, a postdoc at Lamont Doherty, assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, and has been a fellow at Cardiff University before joining University of Utah in March of 2018. As part of her research focus, her website says that her primary research focus is on the chemistry of Earth and planetary interior. So not just the Earth, with a particular emphasis on the role of magma and magma generation processes on the differentiation and chemical evolution of terrestrial planets. So how they work and how they form. And in a summary sort of statement, she uses lab experiments and computer modeling in order to extrapolate beyond what gathered data can directly inform her about Earth mantle types of environments. And on a personal note, even though she is French in her origin, she is not particularly a great fan of cheese, but I'm happy to report that she agrees that she has become a fan of good red wine. So without further ado, allow me to introduce and welcome Sarah Lombard.
Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thanks again for the invitation. Thank you all for being there tonight. And I'm going to start right away sharing my screen. And up. Okay, now you should see my pointer, so it should work. And so, so today I'm going to talk about the mantle, and the research I'm going to talk about, I actually started before joining University of Utah. I started it when I was in UK actually, and this is part of the team. So Johan and Marka are assistant professor in UK. Janne and Gareth are professor in Amsterdam, in VU Amsterdam, and Matthew is an amazing undergraduate student that was working with me during one summer when I was in UK. And so I want to first thank all my collaborators, because this study is really an international project, and I'm glad that we've done that as a team, and science should always be about collaboration. So I wanted to start with that. So today I'm going to talk about the mantle, and specifically I'm going to talk about the upper mantle, where most of the magma on Earth are formed. So this illustration is from a textbook that I'm using to teach petrology, for example, at University of Utah. And this is relatively typical of how we represent the structure of the Earth. Each big reservoir on Earth are usually represented by some kind of a homogeneous layer. But we do know that the mantle is not homogeneous. So the mantle is actually quite heterogeneous. We know it thanks to geophysics. So for example, we can see thanks to seismic tomography that we have the subduction of the slab inside the mantle, so the subduction of the oceanic crust inside the mantle. We know it thanks to numerical modeling that predicts that if you are actually recycling material through subduction zone, you should actually mix this material pretty well inside the mantle. And we know it thanks to geochemistry. So I will come back to the detail of such plot later on, but basically you can see that depending on where you are on the world, at different locations on the world, on Earth, you have different composition of basalts. So all this is telling us that the mantle is heterogeneous, but such length scale of heterogeneity are relatively large. We are actually looking at hundreds of kilometers away between each oceanic island, hundreds of kilometer depths inside the mantle. And even with numerical modeling, you cannot really resolve anything that is smaller than 1 kilometer. So we are talking about large scale heterogeneity. And so that's what I chose to represent as a Mondrian-like nature of the mantle. So large, big reservoir in a heterogeneous mantle. But today, I want to focus on DMM. So DMM is for depleted MORB mantle. And I'm going to explain why I care about this particular reservoir. So first, what is the depleted MORB mantle? The depleted MORB mantle is the mantle where mid-ocean ridge basalt are formed, okay? So this is where magma is produced along the mid-ocean ridge that are represented here. So why is it important? Well, since the 60s, I would say, mostly thanks to Marie Tharp, we know that we have actually very long volcanic chain beneath the sea level that are called mid-ocean ridge. And that's where most of the oceanic floor is formed. And more importantly, that's where 85% of magma that are produced on Earth are formed. So we really need to understand what's going on down there to actually understand Earth's differentiation in general. And so why are we interested into how heterogeneous this particular mantle is because this heterogeneity is mostly the product of recycling. So it's mostly oceanic crust that has been recycled back to the mantle. And the more that you mix, the more you stir, the longer you wait, you will actually reduce the size of this heterogeneity. And you will progressively move from a Mondrian-like mantle to a Pollock-like mantle. And so being able to situate yourself on the scatter between Mondrian-like and Pollock-like mantle is going to give you a lot of information about how plate tectonic is working on Earth, how the recycling cycle is working on Earth, and how convection and stirring is actually efficient on Earth. And so today, what I'm going to do is trying to convince you that the mantle source of MORB, so where most of the magma are formed in the mantle, looks like that. So looks like a Pollock painting. Okay, so to actually being able to convince you that it looks like that, I need to get access to the mantle. And that's the first challenge we have as geoscientists. We do not have access to the mantle, and we certainly don't have access to the mantle source of magma, because we do have some outcrops thanks to tectonics, or we can find xenolites in lavas, but those xenolites from the mantle are from a part of the mantle that we call the lithosphere. And this is not the mantle source of the magma. The mantle source of the magma is the asthenosphere. And we do not have access to the asthenosphere. So just for the record, basically, and for information, we have actually attempted several times to drill through the crust down to the mantle to actually collect samples that are directly reflecting the composition of the mantle, and we failed, basically. So the IODP program managed so far to drill only 4 holes that are deeper than 1 kilometer. And the deepest one is actually 2.1 kilometer. For comparison, the average oceanic crust thickness is between 5 and 7 kilometers. So we are very far away from being able to drill directly in the mantle. Okay, so we need other way to have access to the mantle, indirect way, and that's what I'm going to call for the rest of this talk, proxies. Okay, and so the first proxy that has been used and continue to be used for decades is the composition of the oceanic basalt, and in particular, the basalts that are actually formed directly at mid-ocean ridge. And what type of elements we are, what type of actually compositional signal we are actually looking at, we are actually looking at isotopes in particular. So I'm not going to explain right now how this system works, but if you are interested, I can actually show you at the end of the talk. But the thing that is very nice with isotopes is we say that they do not fractionate during fractionation processes. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the isotopic ratio of your basalt are not going to change during partial melting or during crystallization. This is not the case, for example, when you look at the major element composition of your lava, or if you look at the trace element composition of your lava. And so the result of that is if you see isotopic heterogeneity in your lava that are represented here, you can tell that you have the same isotopic heterogeneity in your mantle source, basically. So that's why we call isotopic ratio fingerprints, basically, because you can directly, basically, or at least that's what we thought, you can directly take the composition, isotopic composition of the lava and say, well, this is exactly the composition of my mantle. Okay, and so when you see some trend like that, most of the time, the way that researchers actually interpret this kind of trend is we have actually mixing in the mantle between two end members, two components, two different lithologies that are in the mantle. Something that is depleted and that probably represents the residue of a partial melting event, and something that is enriched and that probably represents this recycled crust that has been recycled at subduction zone and then, thanks to the convection and stirring, brought back to the source of the mob. Okay, so another way to look at that is to look at the composition, still the isotopic composition, still of the SMOB collected along a mid-ocean ridge. So this is an example with the North Atlantic mid-ocean ridge. And this plot represents the isotopic composition, so the strontium and the neodymium ratio, as a function of the latitude for sample collected along the ridge. And you can definitely see that we have variation. It's not constant, basically. So on the base of this observation, what we actually find out is if we are close to hotspot, so hotspot means potentially the presence of a plume, for example. If you have close to hotspot, you have more enriched composition. So you will have low neodymium ratio and high strontium ratio. So you will have a signature of something that goes toward the participation of recycled material. While if you are far from hotspot, you have actually high neodymium ratio and low strontium ratio. And so you don't have any indication that you have any contribution of this recycling material. And so on the base of this observation, we have said that basically compositional variation of MOB with space mimic the compositional variation in the mantle. So say in other words, basically the length scale of variation we see at the surface along the ridge reflect the length scales of heterogeneity that are present in the mantle. And so if we are still talking about our Mondrian versus Pollock nature of the mantle, we are still looking at large scale heterogeneity. So that's why I put back the Mondrian-like mantle here. Okay. The problem is, by definition, we interpret this trend as the result of mixing. And mixing can blur this fingerprint and potentially significantly. Let me explain. The easiest way to interpret such plots is to say that we have two components in the mantle. One is represented by the most depleted composition in blue here, and one is represented by the most enriched composition in yellow here. The problem is you don't know where these end members are and they could actually be very far away from the trend you have. If you actually started to mix your basalt together, actually you might have lost some of the ones that were plotting along this trend, and maybe your depleted end member is here and maybe your enriched end member is here. And there are even some more recent study that suggest that you could even be offset, basically. Even if you have a nice looking trend, looking relatively linear in this direction, depending on how mixing occur and at which pressure, and if it happens at only one pressure or at several different locations, you might actually be completely offset in comparison to the direction of your true end members. So basically, we need to check that, and using the basalts, we cannot have access to this information because we do know that MORB are affected by magma mixing, and by a lot. We have a lot of other geochemical indications that are actually showing that. So the only reason, the only way to do that is try to have access to samples that are not being affected by mixing, basically. We don't exactly know where this mixing occurs. It occurs before the surface, where MORB are erupted, but we don't really know where. So what are our options to actually study those samples? Well, the most obvious way to actually study the mantle is to look at samples that are from the mantle. And so that's what we call the abyssal peridotites. So that's when you have a piece of mantle on the oceanic floor that is exposed thanks to a tectonic event, thanks to the presence of a transform fault, for example, or thanks to the fact that you have a very low magmatic activity at this particular location that expose directly the mantle. And so this is perfect. Normally, you have access directly to the composition of your mantle. You can analyze this composition. And an abyssal peridotite, when you think about a peridotite, you might think about something like that. So those are actually thin section, so very thin slice of rocks seen under the microscopes. And with a petrographic microscope, we have actually two modes that we can use. We have what we call plane polarized light and cross polarized light. But what you can see on this picture is these samples look very fresh. You don't, most of this sample is colorless and in PPL, and that's what we expect for a fresh peridotite. And in XPL EC, you can see some very vivid color, and that again what we can expect for a very fresh sample of peridotite. Unfortunately, that's not what you will get when you actually sample abyssal peridotite. If you want to sample abyssal peridotite, what you will get is that. So all this yellow part in PPL is serpentine, and all this black part in PPL is serpentine too. And so basically abyssal peridotite are most of the case extremely serpentinized, and this transformation of olivine into serpentine is an alteration process that will significantly modify the composition of your peridotite. This is due to seawater alteration most of the time, and so you can't really trust the composition that you get from samples that looks like that. They are going to be too modified by seawater alteration. Another thing you can use are melt inclusions. So what are melt inclusions? Melt inclusions are small pockets of magma that are trapped in crystal when the crystal forms. So this is a funny example from a sample I collected in Hawaii 2 years ago. And this sample actually erupted during the 2018 eruption. So the one that created this huge fissure eruption that we actually seen for months online, basically. And so I missed the eruption, but I managed to collect some samples coming from this eruption. And so what you can see is a crystal of olivine in a lava. And this bubble here are the melt inclusion. So really small pocket of magma that are trapped in the melt inclusion. So melt inclusion, if you can analyze them, you might actually, because olivine crystallize very early in the crystallization sequence, you might actually avoid some of the mixing processes. The problem of the melt inclusion is, first, we don't really know where they form, so we are not completely sure you avoid actually magma mixing. Second, these are actually the 101 best example of melt inclusions that you can get, and most of the time they are one, much smaller, and second, they are not that glassy. They can actually be very crystallized, which makes extremely challenging to actually study their composition in particular. It's doable, and actually the lab where I did this project is doing that now, and it's a new technique that is developed, but it is challenging. What we are proposing for this particular project is to study a third type of samples. And these samples are the layered gabbro that you can find at the base of the crust. And in this particular type of rocks, we are going to look at the ones that what we call them the most primitive ones. So the ones that are the most rich in magnesium, for example, because usually that's the ones that are considered that crystallize the first, okay? And we are going to make the hypothesis that those cumulates are formed before magma mixing, that magma mixing occurs somewhere here, and that those cumulates somehow are preserved of most of the magma mixing that might affect the composition of the MORB that we can collect at the surface. If we are correct, then those gabbros, those layered cumulate, should actually record a much larger heterogeneity than what is recorded by the MORB. If we are not correct, and as some people say, magma mixing mostly occur at the base of the crust in the mantle, then normally we should see about the same range of heterogeneity in this cumulate than we see in the MORBs. Okay. Okay, so which sample did we target? What we wanted to do is to target samples that, when you look at the MORB compositions, look extremely depleted. So doesn't show any evidence of interaction with a hotspot, doesn't show any evidence of recycled material participating to magma mixing and to the genesis of this particular mid-ocean ridge basalt. And so we target samples that were actually drilled by the IODP mission at 30° north on a place that is called the Atlantis Massif. And it is actually known to be extremely depleted, so not showing any presence of recycling material in the source when you look at the composition of the MORB. So this is the Atlantis Massif, basically. So it's a core complex that has been elevated, basically, because of tectonics, because of the presence of this transform fault here. And they did a drill core in 2003 on the top of this core complex, and they managed to recover 1,400 meters of rocks. So this is one of the best recovery by IODP, and this is one of the 4 drill holes I was mentioning you about earlier that actually managed to drill inside the crust to more than 1 kilometer depth. So what we did is we first went to Marum. So this is in Bremen, it's the IODP repository. And because the expedition occurred more than 10 years ago, all the samples are now available to the public. So you can go to the IODP repository and say, well, I have this proposal, I would like to study this rock for this particular reason, and I would like to sample this particular core. So that's what we did. And so we went over the 1,400 meters of course, and we selected the samples that looked, petrographically speaking, the most primitive as possible, because we were targeting the samples that hopefully were crystallizing first during the crystallization process. The second thing we did is element map of these samples. So this is an example of one of these element maps. So this is a gabbro. In blue, you can see plagioclase. And in green to red, you can see clinopyroxene. And in black, those are actually olivine, and they appear in black because you don't have much anorthite. You don't have much calcium and sodium actually in olivine, and you don't have much titanium and chromium in olivine either. So you are not going to see them on an element map like that. And why did we do such element map? We did such element map to show the compositional heterogeneity on a very small scale of a sample. So this is basically 4 centimeters wide. And as you can see, you have a large variation of composition, even at the scale of less than 1 centimeter. And so by doing this element map, we were able to target the zone in plagioclase and in clinopyroxene that are the most primitive, so that are interpreted as crystallizing first. Okay, so that will appear on this element map as dark blue for the plagioclase and dark green for the clinopyroxene. The second thing we did is micromill these minerals, and so we micromill only this very primitive section like that. So this is what is illustrated here. This is an example of a setup with a micromile, except that the one that I actually used was in a fume hood because we wanted to avoid any contamination as much as possible. And so this is what we actually do. We micromile the samples. We control that by a computer, and while it's actually micromiling, we are collecting the sample. And so this is a scene section that has been done after the study, after we actually collect this sample for analysis. And you can see that this clinopyroxene has a big hole now in the middle, and so we can check after the study to make sure that we really well target one particular mineral, etc. The next step is to do column chemistry. So the idea right now is to take the small samples, the small slurry of your samples, and to only extract what you want to analyze. To only extract strontium on one side and neodymium on the other side. And because at the end, you basically only have like a few nanogram of samples in your small beaker, you need nice glasses like that give you a very smart look to actually figure out if you still have a sample in your beaker. And the last part is the isotopic analysis by itself. So this represents basically the sample. So to give you an idea, this is maybe a quarter of an inch. And so you redissolve your sample into some acid to deposit it on this filament of rhenium. And so this will go in a big apparatus. And so you can do your isotopic analysis from that. Okay, so let's look at the sample that we obtained. So we've seen this figure before. So this shows the compositional variation of the MORB as a function of the latitude along the mid-Atlantic ridge for strontium and for neodymium. And what I did is with the red arrow here, I indicated the spread of composition that we have in the MORB at this particular location. And these are our result. As you can see, the compositional variability that we actually observe at this particular location for this drill core is much larger than the compositional variation that has been observed in the lava at the surface before. So to give you an idea, we have at least a factor 7 between what we actually record in our cumulates and what was only preserved in the lava. And what's interesting too is the range of heterogeneity that we see in our one single location at 30 degrees north is on the same order of magnitude that the range of heterogeneity compositional heterogeneity that we see for the entire North Atlantic. So what we did then is we actually tried to play a little bit with this data, and we added another constraint. This is actually the elevation below the sea level of the MORB that has been collected along this ridge. Okay, so this time I'm just looking basically on how deep the sample were collected. So here they were collected at the surface. We are basically at the level of Iceland, and if you go to the left, they are where they are basically more and more deep. And the elevation of your samples is a proxy for the crustal thickness. So in Iceland, you have a thick crust, and somewhere here you have actually a thin crust. And so you can play with all these constraints to try to find, okay, what is the fraction of recycled material and what is the thermal regime do I need to actually reproduce these samples? And so that's what we did. And so we first actually changed only the temperature by keeping the fraction of recycled material constant. Then we actually change the fraction of recycled material, but keep the temperature constant. And finally, we change both the recycled material and the temperature together. And as you can see with this hybrid model, we have a perfect fit. So you do need to have both temperature variation and a variation of the fraction of the recycled material inside your mantle to explain your data. But what's interesting to note is actually, if you just look at variation of the recycled material, except for this big thermal anomaly that is related to Iceland, you have a pretty good fit. While if you only change the temperature, the fit is terrible. Like you cannot explain anything by just changing the temperature. So the conclusion of that is really that what you need is a small variation of the temperature coupled with a variation of your recycled material. So as a preliminary conclusion, basically what our study showed is really that the mantle is much more heterogeneous than was previously assumed by actually looking only at MORB composition. So just to actually introduce what we have been doing since we finished this study and at University of Utah in particular, there are actually still several questions, of course, that are not answered by our project. And the first is, what is the nature of the recycling material? Because the problem of the isotopes is they don't actually tell you much about what type of rocks are melting. They are telling you about a geochemical signal, a flavor for recycled material, but they are not telling you if it's a peridotite or pyroxenite, if it's mostly olivine or if it's mostly garnet that melt in the source. The second question that is still unsolved basically is how do we actually transport magma to the surface? And I'm going to talk about that very briefly, but I just want to take a few minutes to talk about that first. Okay, so one way to actually determine what type of rocks melt in the mantle has been proposed in the last decades, and it's to use the first row transition elements. Okay, so that's all these elements that are presented here. We can't use major elements because major elements are going to be the same whatever the type of rock you are melting. You can't use the isotopes because the isotopes are going to inform you about the geochemical flavor, as I said, but it's not going to give you any information about what rocks is melting, what type of minerals are contributing to this melting. So FRTs are actually a good innovative proxy to try to find out what type of rocks are melting. And so I'm just going to show you very briefly how that works. The way FRT works is those different elements, those different FRTs are not going to partition the same way in the different minerals that are present in the mantle. When I say partition, I simply want to say that nickel is going to prefer to go in olivine, for example, and manganese is going to prefer to go in garnet. So that's what is illustrated here. Okay, so olivine will be rich in nickel and poor in manganese, and progressively garnet is going to be rich in manganese and will have almost no nickel. So you can use this behavior by trying to trying to constrain what type of rocks is melting in your mantle by looking at the composition of your basalt. So I'm looking at my mantle source, and it contains both manganese and nickel for my particular example. If my mantle source is made of peridotite, then I have a rock that is dominated by olivine and orthopyroxene. And if I melt this rock, what's going to happen is you will produce basalt that has a high manganese nickel ratio, because the nickel is going to stay in your mantle because it's actually preferred to stay in the olivine. On the contrary, if you have a pyroxenite, you will create a magma that has a low manganese nickel ratio, because this time all the nickels wants to escape your source because you don't have enough olivine to actually keep this nickel in, and you will actually have more manganese staying in your mantle source because you have more garnet and clinopyroxene that likes to have manganese in their structure. And so the problem with these proxies is we have relatively few data on them. They are promising, but we are missing some information. Especially, we have a lot of data on manganese and iron. We have very few data on zinc and nickel, and we have almost no data on the rest. And so Otto Lang, a graduate student, and Sarah Hamilton, an undergraduate student in my group, have been working on trying to characterizing these particular elements using natural samples, because we have plenty of natural samples and we just need actually to do more analysis. And so they have been working on some very nice natural samples. So this is actually pyroxenite from Beni Bussera. So you can see a hand samples of a picture of an outcrop here. So you see layer of pyroxenites and layer in gray and layer of peridotite in orange brown. And this massif in Morocco is particularly famous to be rich in pyroxenite. And this xenolite, again, it's a thin section photograph, is a xenolite from San Carlos. So that's where the sample come from on the pictures that I use for that they use for the flyer for this talk. And so on the hand samples, you can see that in San Carlos, in Arizona, you can find some nice xenolites of peridotite in green, but also some xenolites of pyroxenite in black, and so that are actually in lava, that is represented by the gray here. And what you see in this picture is you have actually a nice contact between pyroxenite on the left and peridotite on the right. But it's really in XPL that those two samples are actually my favorite one. I really love these two samples. This one because of the huge deformations that are observed in this large porphyroblast of pyroxene, actually. They are so deformed that when I saw them initially, I thought they were plagioclase because I thought what I was observing was polysynthetic twins. But for those who knows a little bit about petrography under a microscope, but still, it's just very beautiful. And so this one, now you can also see this nice contrast between the orthopyroxenes that show relatively less vivid color from the peridotites that show very vivid color because of the olivine. And so what Otto actually has been doing this last few months is proposing a very innovative method to actually use a larger range of FRTs as potential lithologic tracer. I'm just going to show you an example of what we can do when we actually combine FRTs instead of using one particular FRT. So this is an example where I look at two magma suites, so one from Iceland and one from the Samoa Island, and he's plotting the results that he got from his result from the manganese content in this particular basalt. And so and he's plotting that in a ternary diagram where you have olivine and orthopyroxene on the top, so something that is more peridotitic, and clinopyroxene and garnet on the bottom, so something that is more pyroxenitic. And you can see that when you use manganese, well, the Iceland is predicting a source that is more peridotitic, and the Samoa is predicting a source that is more pyroxenitic, but you still have overlap, and technically maybe your source could be here, and then you don't have any distinction between Samoa and Iceland. But you can do the same exercise by using another FRT, such as zinc, and this time you actually don't have any overlap. But where it's becoming interesting is when you actually combine these two plots and look where those intersections actually are. And if you extract that, you can actually reduce by a lot and constrain very significantly what is actually the type of rocks that melts and produce the magma at the surface. So this is a very innovative technique, because so far people has been mostly using peridotite or pyroxenite by fixing themselves and randomly the mineral proportion in this type of two rocks, while he actually doesn't do that. He lets the calculation actually run that for him with more flexible parameter, and he still managed to constrain a relatively small range of compositions that can explain actually different FRTs in the composition of the basalt that are observed. So this is very promising. The second thing that we are working on is the magma transport, how magma are delivered to the crust, because something I actually did not highlight before, but by doing this particular study on the Atlantis Massif, what we realize is we have isotopic heterogeneity on the scale of a Lego brick. So on the scale of, less than an inch, we have minerals that do not have the same isotopic ratio. How do you do that? How do you manage to deliver to the crust two melts with two different isotopic ratio without any mixing, without any interaction? How do they actually preserve their geochemical signal? Well, that's what Emily is actually going to work on. Emily is a PhD student that started in my lab in January, and we are going to develop this new experimental technique in high temperature furnaces, where we can actually simulate the circulation of a melt through a silicate matrix. So the silicate matrix will be the mantle and the melt will be the magma. And what we want to know is what are the conditions necessary to preserve the geochemical signal of this melt, and inversely, what type of modification this melt is going to undergo while it goes and travels through the mantle. And I'm going to stop here and leave you with this very nice element map of an oceanic gabbros that we collected during this mission, that show big compositional variation in clinopyroxene in this direction and big compositional variation in plagioclase in this direction. And I will take questions. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Sarah?
Yes, I can.
All right, we do have a couple of questions. During Earth's 4.6 billion year history, how well mixed do you believe the mantle has been able to become?
So that's actually an excellent question, and it's extremely debatable because people disagree on the onset of plate tectonics. And to actually have mixing in the mantle, you do need to have plate tectonics, because plate tectonics is a driver of convection, and convection is a driver of mantle mixing. And so my observation is now we definitely have a mantle that looks like, as I said, a Pollock painting, and so it's extremely mixed, and so mixing has been extremely efficient, basically, and to actually reach that. But the problem is we still don't know how did we manage to be that efficient on this particular period of time, because the period of time is not necessarily well constrained. Some people think that plate tectonics started only 2 billion years ago. Some people think that plate tectonics started actually way earlier than that, and something that is more around 3.5 billion years ago.
Well, I kind of a little more, how much mixing has occurred between the lower and upper mantles throughout Earth's.
Again, great questions. That's actually come back to the initial model in geochemistry. So there are two basically contradicting model in geochemistry that started, I would say, in the 80s or something like that, the big work of Al Hoffman and Bill McDonough, basically. And you have this contrasted model. In one side, you have two types of convection cell, and they are separated by the transition zone. And so you have one level of mixing in the upper mantle and one level of mixing in the lower mantle, and you don't necessarily have interaction between those two. This model is supported, by example, by analysis done on helium-3. And so I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but helium-3 give a signature of a primordial mantle, and this is interpreted as a signal that of a mantle that has never been touched, never been extracted, never been depleted, etc. So it's completely actually protected from the rest of the Earth, and we only see it at a couple of OIBs, and because we see this signature, that supports the model of a two convection model. On the other way around, we actually see also a lot of evidence that we do have a full convection in the mantle. So actually what the direction that geochemist takes today is this is not fixed with time. Like basically there is no one convection model or two convection model. It depends on when you look in the Earth history. We did add a two convection model and we did have a one convection model, and it probably vary with time and space.
And let's see, can you offer thoughts on why we have plate tectonics on Earth, but the other solar system, rocky planets, Venus and Mars, have not developed plate tectonics?
I need to think about it. That's a very good question. I need to. Why do we actually initiated plate tectonic on Earth and not necessarily on other systems?
You can pass.
That's an excellent question, and yeah, I'm going to pass. Right, I'm going to think about it and come back later on this particular question because I don't actually have an answer right now.
So, from how deep in the mantle do you believe that samples we see on Earth's surface have come?
That's an excellent question. So if we are talking, it depends where you are looking at. So if you look at some sample from the mantle, you have basically two types of samples. You have the ones that are lithospheric, and you have the ones that are, so when I say lithospheric, I'm talking about ultramafic massif. So layers is one particular example where the word layersolite come from, for example, and you have the xenolites that are collected in lava, as the one I actually shown in San Carlos. Most of the time, we consider that those samples are relatively low pressure for mantle pressure. So usually 1-2 GPa max. So in terms of depth, I'm talking about 60 kilometer depths. Occasionally, you can have samples that come from much, much, much deeper, and we have evidence for that. So we have kimberlites that have diamond into it, and diamond is only stable at pressure that is higher than 6 GPa. So this is 200 kilometers, so it has to be at least deeper than 200 kilometers. It's more rare in lithospheric samples, so in ultramafic massif, but there is actually one example, and it's Beni Bussara. So the sample, the example I show you on the picture before, because there are actually samples in Beni Bussara. We don't find diamond, but we find graphite that is pseudomorph of diamond. So the internal structure is graphite, but it kept the external structure of a diamond. And because of that, we know that this parcel of mantle was once at pressure of stability of diamond. But this is a one-time thing for ultramafic massif, and the only massif I know that have this particularity is Beni Busera. For xenolites, kimberlites are not that common, but they are at several places in the world.
How important are, ophiolites for studying the Earth's mantle?
Extremely important. So for those who don't know what is an ophiolite is the part of the oceanic crust that instead of being subducted back to the mantle, it's actually abducted, so ophiolite. So it goes on the top of another oceanic crust usually. And so this way you can preserve the structure of the oceanic crust like that. We have a good example of an ophiolite in California, Trinity ophiolite, and the largest one is in Oman, actually, the Oman ophiolite. And it's extremely important. We know there are a lot of things that we know regarding the structure of the oceanic crust, basically, that is directly related to study of ophiolites. We do have access sometimes to the base of the crust, really the moho and the transition to the mantle when we look at these ophiolites. So you can do similar, actually the work I have done has been done on ophiolite before, on samples coming from ophiolite before. The only problem that you might face with ophiolite is you don't necessarily know that it's coming from a mid-ocean ridge. There are actually a lot of debate. This last science is about debate, and that's good. But a lot of debate this last 10 years that most of the ophiolites might actually reflect more back arc magmatism than ridge magmatism. So this is a small basin that is formed behind the subduction zone usually. And so if you are not going to necessarily have the composition that is really the ambient mantle and the normal mantle, because you might be actually relatively close to a subduction zone that has other application, fluids, etc., etc. There is that, and there is the time. And with time, the isotopic ratio are going to change by definition, because an isotopic ratio evolves with time with radioactive decay. And the problem is, if you cannot perfectly date your tectonic events that brought back the ophiolite at the surface, this will induce a lot of error on the isotopic ratios that you try to measure and correct for this time.
Let's see. Are there any implications for hotspots? And how deep is in the mantle are the hotspots created? Is that part of your?
I can definitely answer that. So yeah, so that's a good question. It's a very excellent question, really. So the hotspot thing, there is like a debate. Are hotspots real or not, basically? And some people think they are, some people think they are not. I can actually, I think, at least give you my opinion about that. So my area of expertise is to actually show that the mantle is heterogeneous everywhere and not necessarily at the hotspot. But that being said, I do think you still need thermal anomalies. The reason for that is because when you add recycled material, this recycled material is usually in the form of pyroxenite. And pyroxenite is a rock that is dense. So if you just put pyroxenite in a mantle that is purely peridotic, it will sink and it will not produce magma, basically. So if you want to have an heterogeneous mantle, you also need to have a hot mantle. So I would say that the direct implication of my research regarding that is to try to reconciliate these two models where people say it's only about temperature or it's only about composition. I actually do think that you need both high temperature and compositional heterogeneity to explain what we see at the surface, both at mid-ocean ridge and at oceanic island. That was one part of the question. The second part of the question is how deep they are. It depends which hotspot. I think Hawaii is an exception, really. Like there is it has been taken for a very, very long time as the hotspot, as the example of hotspot to talk about all the hotspot on the world. It's the exception, actually. We should, it's the only one. And for Hawaii, we have big geochemical evidence that this one is seated at the core mantle boundary, so that deep. I don't think there are other hotspots like Hawaii on Earth. And that's actually something intriguing. If you look at the repartition of the hotspot on the world, Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific plate, and that's the only one. All the other oceanic hotspots on the world are actually relatively close to continental margin. Cape Verde, Azores, all of them, basically, they are very close to the continental margin. So Hawaii is core mantle boundary. The other one, I can't tell how deep. You do need a thermal anomaly. So you do need high temperature, but I don't think they sit down to the core mantle boundary.
Well, I think that's the end of our questions. Yeah, that was fabulous. And thank you. And
But thanks again for inviting me.
oh, you're very welcome. And with a glass of red wine. And I think I'm supposed to tell everybody that thank you for joining. And hopefully we'll see everybody in 2 weeks at 5 o'clock Jackson Hole time. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.